Hello and welcome to the Arise interview, where we take time to reflect on the big stories from the news and on the fortunes and affairs of the world in an hour of conversation with commentators, analysts and thought leaders. I'm Charles Aniegolu. Coming up in the next 60 minutes, the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, which issues regular reports on standards of governance in Africa, has highlighted what it says is a decline across the continent. Its latest index refers to failings in the rule of law, security and human rights, among others. The study covers the period just before the pandemic, and its data is taken from all 54 countries on the continent. So what does that tell us about democracy in Africa and how the continent is progressing? We'll speak to a professor of political science and distinguished fellow at the Center for Democracy and Development in Abuja. And later, as the US President-elect Joe Biden sounds a note of warning about the faltering transition and its effect on the ravaging pandemic in America, trying to flare some light amid the growing gloom roaring across the United States, we speak with one of America's most seasoned public relations managers, who's cultivated the careers of some of the country's most renowned celebrities, working with the likes of Diana Ross, Stevie Wonder, Smokey Robinson, the Jackson 5 and Motown Records, and beyond the US, Nelson Mandela. Lynn Allen Jeter, America's PR guru, coming up. Now, governance in Africa has got worse over the past year, according to the Mo Ibrahim Foundation. Its data, taken from all 54 countries on the continent, shows a deterioration in areas such as social inclusion, human rights and the rule of law, among others. It's the first time in 10 years that its measure of good governance has declined. The Mo Ibrahim Index of African governance, published every 2 years, gives each country's government a score according to criteria including, as I mentioned, anti-corruption measures, protection of civil liberties, and caring for the environment. The foundation, which was set up in 2006 to focus on the need for good political leadership and public governance in Africa, also cited growing curbs on people's ability to exercise their democratic rights and take part in civil society. But many African countries have accused the foundation of publishing only negative reports about their state of affairs. Well, in a moment we'll have analysis from a distinguished fellow of the Center for Democracy and Development here in Abuja. But first, here's Mo Ibrahim himself explaining how the index works.
We really wanted to talk about governance, and we want to simplify the discussion about governance. How are we going to talk about governance? We don't want to talk poetry or to talk. We said, we can quantify it. That was the whole idea behind the index. We said, okay, governance, what's good governance? It's about the rule of law, it's about paying attention to education, health services you're providing, it's about the rights of women, civil society, management of public finance, about infrastructure, clean water, electricity. It's a basket of public goods which each government needs to deliver to its people. And we thought all that is measured, can be measured. So why don't we measure all this in all 54 countries and publish it every year? Then there is a clear picture of what's happening really on the ground. And people can talk about governance in an objective and measured way. It's not about good speeches. Some of our politicians, will love just deliver a nice speech or sing or dance or whatever. And so it's not about charming the people, it's about what you deliver.
Mo Ibrahim. Well, for analysis of the latest index of good governance in Africa, I'm joined now in the studio by the political scientist and distinguished fellow at the Center for Democracy and Development in Abuja, Professor Ebere Onwudiwe, who until recently was the Director of African Studies at the Central State University in Wilberforce, Ohio in the US. Great to see you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me.
Just outline for us broadly and briefly the main thrust of this year's Index of African Governance by the Mo Ibrahim Foundation. It seems to show a decline in progress for the first time in a decade.
Yes, well, and that's not to be unexpected for those who've been observing the trends of political governance in the continent. But overall in the world, we have had these periods of democratic recession.
I like that term, democratic recession.
Yes,
Brilliant.
of course, yes. And Africa has been part of it. And so the Mo Ibrahim's Index, as he said in his introduction, tries to capture these in numbers, to quantify them so that we know exactly what we're talking about. And I think the starting point is with a definition that depicts governance in terms of what it brings to citizens, and that's why he used the term public goods, puts it in the form of public goods, so that something I think in our country we used to call democratic dividend, something that actually gives us a good measure of what democracy has brought to the table for all the Nigerian citizens. And I think since 2010, this is the first time they're noticing a drop year to year in these kinds of measures.
And what has been the driver of this decline in progress in governance?
Well, I think a lot of it has been bad governance, so to say.
Well, that pretty much answers it.
Yes, bad governance, a lot of impunity with which African governments been doing things, a lot of issues of insecurity, a lot of issues of poverty, and followership that is in a lot of decline because of lack of education.
But on the issue of security, for instance, I mean, some governments would argue that that's not a fair measure because oftentimes when there's insecurity, it's not necessarily their fault. Is the argument by Mo Ibrahim and his foundation that it is as a result of bad governance that leads to insecurity and therefore people taking up arms against the central government?
Exactly. I think that is the premise to
Right.
it, because if there is lack of inclusiveness, which is a measure of one of the measures of governance that the foundation takes on, if there is issue of unfairness and injustice, which is all part of it, if there's denial of effective participation by the citizenry, if the state is captured by a bunch of people in government, and therefore allows corruption that takes bread out of the table of citizens. That's all measures of bad governance, and they can produce situations of conflict because people would like to resist this, and if they're not being listened to, then they can take the laws into their own hands. And if there is lack of rule of law, which they observe in many African countries among the rulers, and rule of law is an important part of good governance. But the government has to set example of obeying its own laws and its own constitutions. And if people are observing that the government is not doing that, they are indirectly inducing them into taking actions that defy the rule of law.
That's a very, very, very good analysis. So which countries have performed best and which have done badly? I guess there are a couple of pretty good improvements, surprising improvements, such as Somalia, in spite of the challenges it faces.
Okay. Well, I think Somalia is a good place to start there. Well, because the ones that have been doing good, well, it has been doing well, even though we didn't expect it. But, when you really think of the case of Somalia, you wonder what is being captured by the work of the foundation. Because I have not read the full report, But I can't imagine Somalia doing so well, except because for many years there's been almost absence of government.
Well, that's a good point, but also the indices that they use are varied. And in some categories, Somalia has done well in the provision of infrastructure, in the attempt to start rebuilding the country, having been absolutely shattered by conflict,
conflicts,
and
yes.
those kinds of things. So
Yes.
it's doing well in that direction. In other words, there's measurable progress. For example,
Yes.
there wasn't a road here, there's now a road here,
Yes.
that sort of thing.
But you know, it all depends on what part of Somalia they're also talking about.
of course.
It could be areas that are controlled by Al-Shabaab, for instance. And we have some indications that Al-Shabaab, the terrorist group, is actually in the area that it has occupied, is a de facto authority there, and is providing some kind of it's actually doing good governance
Right.
in the areas that, yeah. So actually,
Yeah, but I don't think they're measuring terrorist groups that have taken over sort of swathes of a country. I think they're measuring sort of the government. That's why it's democratic governance.
yes, but you know, they do the measurements by asking questions. You know, that's how they do the measurement. You know, I don't know that the commissions.
Well, there are surveys.
The commissions.
There are
yes, they do
surveys that they
yes.
do, but
Yeah.
also.
So if you are
obviously-
living in an area that is controlled by those people and you get these surveys and you see that they're making some provisions on the ground, building these roads you're talking about, limiting corruption
Right.
among themselves, you probably will answer in the affirmative.
Yeah, but I expect it might be rather difficult to get a survey into an area controlled by Boko Haram or sort of Al-Shabaab. Of course, the criteria they use to measure good and bad governance are quite important, aren't they? I think there are 4 categories. There's safety, I mean broadly,
Yes.
there are other subcategories.
Yes.
But safety and the rule of law, participation and human rights, sustainable economic opportunity, which is part of what you were saying, and human development. I
Yes.
understand human development was the highest scoring of the 4 categories of governance. We've got about 20 seconds before we have to take a break.
Okay, well, yes, and I think human development is about the best place to pay attention because it is the enduring infrastructure that you know, investing in people rather than investing in other types of infrastructure.
Right. Please stay with us. We're going to take a short break. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our analysis of the latest index of good governance in Africa. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Eniegolu. Now, according to the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, African countries are not making progress in good governance. The Mo Ibrahim Index of African governance, published every 2 years, gives each country's government a score according to criteria including anti-corruption measures, security, human rights, social inclusion, protection of civil liberties, and caring for the environment. It says there's an increasingly precarious environment for human rights and civic participation, as well as a deteriorating security situation. The incumbent presidents of Guinea and Ivory Coast succeeded in pushing through constitutional changes, allowing them to stand for a 3rd term, sparking deadly unrest there. In Nigeria, largely peaceful youth-led protests against a hated police unit spilled over into looting and violence. And last week, the UN called for urgent measures to protect civilians in Mozambique's northeastern Cabo Delgado province, where jihadists are wreaking havoc. And with me in the studio, the political scientist and distinguished fellow at the Center for Democracy and Development in Abuja, Professor Ebere Onwudiwe, who until recently was the Director of African Studies at the Central State University in Wilberforce, Ohio in the US. Thank you for staying with us.
Thank you again.
And of course, I know a lot of people watching this program will be saying, well, what's the situation in Nigeria?
Yes.
What did they say?
Well, you know, in this current study by Mo Ibrahim Foundation, we scored 34 out of 54. which is about...
We being Nigeria.
Nigeria, yes.
Right.
Nigeria, excuse me. Yes, Nigeria scored that. And so that's about 44.5%. And so that's not a pass mark.
Yeah.
And the areas where we didn't do very well would be in security, in participation, and somehow in inclusiveness and human rights, according to this current study. And so in the case of Nigeria, you can say that they sort of were right on the money.
Well, let's drill down further into Nigeria, because, I mean, you know, that's where we are.
Yes.
And just earlier in the day, reports coming from Kaduna, the route between Kaduna. Yesterday, a lot of people attempted kidnaps, number of people killed. Today, again, villages around Kaduna ravaged by bandits, at least 16 people killed, in an area where there are thousands of troops. What do you think is behind that level of insecurity there? Is it bad intelligence? Is it something else, perhaps?
Well, actually, it will all be speculation, because we don't know exactly what's behind it. But it's good to worry about it, because if you would have these kinds of military manpower there, you would think that there will be, and a lot of Nigerian military investments are in that corridor.
Absolutely.
Of Kaduna's area. And you would think that that would be the safest spot.
And I think what is most alarming is the fact that these people almost comprehensively rob places and attack places over several hours.
Yes, yes, and nothing happens. So sometimes you wonder whether there is some kind of conniving going on, but you can't say that, because, as I said, that would be speculation. We don't know for fact. But it is a measure of the deterioration of security governance. You know, it is a measure of it, because it's a measure of general insecurity, a general atmosphere of violence, a general permissiveness to for these kinds of bad security.
And beyond sort of Nigeria, which countries gave you the greatest cause for concern based on the assessment made by this report? Just your cursory analysis.
Well, you know, I as I said, I haven't done a lot of the review of the full report, but from what we have, Angola is not doing very well.
Yes, Angola was close to the bottom.
Yes, yeah. Exactly, and that would give you concern, because this is not a country that is going to complain of wealth, because of course it's an oil-producing country. But it seems to be the case of Angola suffering the same general problem of oil doom rather than oil boom.
Commodity-driven countries.
Exactly, yeah.
And according to the report, majority of Africans are less satisfied today with their country's governance performance than they were 10 years ago. So that's a marked decline in public perception for governments in Africa. How telling is that, and how much should governments be concerned by that? Because of course their performance is, or ought to be, I think you pointed this out earlier, rooted in the kind of results they deliver to their citizens.
Yes. Well, it wouldn't surprise me if people express deep disaffection to their governments, if they express deep disappointment because of lack of provision of good governance for the benefit of the people, bad roads, bad hospitals, bad places to train their children in schools. So, if I mean, as the study has found that there is bad governance, it follows that people would have will be disappointed, that they will show disappointment with their governments.
And do you think that perhaps COVID-19, although arguably this study was done just before the advent of COVID, but yes, I expect that part of the mood, the declining, because it's showing a declining trend, the mood of the people was probably affected by COVID-19 and the challenge many countries faced as a result?
Oh yes, because you know
It exposed the lack of infrastructure, basically, health and all that sort
of course, and deep poverty in many places. All that were there before COVID. Nigeria was already rated as being the poverty capital of the world before COVID, and so whether that's COVID or not, this rating would have gone down. But I do agree with some of the African governments who question.
Well, that was going to be my next question.
Yes.
Is it your sense that this governance index is a fair assessment? Because many African governments have accused the Mo Ibrahim Foundation of publishing only negative results about their state of affairs.
Well, I don't know that they go out of their ways to publish negative things. But I do think that the methodology they use is going to be questioned by the Africans. You know, Africans don't have ownership to Mo Ibrahim studies, but they do have their own APRM, African Peer Review mechanism, which is their own, you know. And so when it depends on how seriously the methods that are applied are used, because when the Mo Ibrahim people go to do these studies, do they commission in-country experts?
Yeah, actually, they do. They say that, in fairness to them, that their findings are based not just on assessment done by the foundation, but it is based on findings and information gathered by several credible research groups within and without the country. And so it is a more collective assessment.
Okay. Yeah, so you know, because if you don't involve the people within in-country of all these African places, then they will question, unless they actually can, unless people from experts from their own countries are part of the evaluation of what.
But there are some pretty obvious things, though, aren't there? I mean, when it comes to...
Well, I don't think they were doing this at the beginning.
Right.
At the beginning, they weren't doing this, because at the beginning, ECA was doing this, but the Mo Foundation wasn't doing this. They probably have begun to do it, but I don't believe that they go out of their way to create a negative African image. I don't think so. But I do agree with the African governments that say, when you say Mauritius is number one, what does it actually mean? When you say Angola is the last one, what does it actually mean? It doesn't mean much for these African countries, because unlike the corruption index, which studies have shown have impact in investments, I don't think that these studies have this kind of significance for these African countries, and that's probably why they're looking down on it.
Professor Ebere Onwudiwe, a distinguished fellow at the Center for Democracy and Development in Abuja, and of course a political scientist. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me.
You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead, including we speak to one of America's most seasoned public relations gurus as the US President-elect Joe Biden sounds a note of warning about the country's faltering transition. Stay with us.